So The Last of Us Part 2 has basically been out for 2 years now, and it's a game that I really enjoyed. I completed it twice over the 2 years, and I really appreciated the risks it took and how it pretty much didn't care about fan service, obviously prompting an absolutely huge backlash from incel anti-SJWs who couldn't handle something that happened to some of the characters, which I will talk about a bit later, but this is going to be completely filled with spoilers. I'm not going to mention it straight away in case you've just clicked on this and you don't think it's going to be full of spoilers, but it will be full of spoilers. But today what I wanted to talk about specifically was the very apparent Israel-Palestine parallel in this game, and it pretty much stems from, I guess, Neil Druckmann's own experience of growing up in the occupied West Bank and his experience of following Israeli politics. And you guys can probably even tell from the surface that like the WLF are meant to be the Israeli Defense Force, the Seraphites are meant to be the Palestinians, and then we're going to go through all of this. And there's a good Vice article written about this by another Israeli criticising the more centrist stance of The Last of Us on this conflict. So all of that coming up for you today, but before we go any further, this video will be demonetized, of course. I'm going to be talking about Israel, Palestine, terrorism, all these different things. So won't be monetized. So if you want to support my work continuing for the future, please consider becoming a patron. I want to build up as many $1 to $3 patrons as possible, and the benefits of that are getting my Nintendo Switch friend code and access to the private patrons Discord server. Also follow me on social media at the Kavernacle on Twitter, on Instagram. Check out my subreddit down in the description. Also check out my second channel, the Kavernacle Extra, where I archive my live stream. Sorry for no live stream yesterday. There will be another one this week at some point. Also, for every 5k we get a new chocolate orange. Here's a pyramid right now. Let's keep working to make this even bigger. Who knows how many I will get by the end of the year. And for today's question, I guess, let's just keep it like Last of Us related. What is your favourite moment of either Last of Us game? And because this game got such an insane backlash, another question I will ask is, what is the dumbest criticism you have seen of part 2 in particular? Also, don't forget to like the video to support it, and if you want to watch more content from me on The Last of Us, just type in the Kavernacle Last of Us onto YouTube. I've made multiple videos either addressing some of the poor criticism towards the second game, or just like my thoughts on the game in general, so go seek that out. Last of Us 2 is probably one of my favourite games over the last couple years, and we're going into full spoiler territory now, so if you have not played this game and you want to go in spoiler free, please do not watch any further. And the decision to kill off Joel right at the start was something I actually really appreciated. And that might sound weird because we all like Joel to a degree. From the first game, we've been on this journey with him, and of course at the end he makes that decision to rescue Ellie and stop the Fireflies from potentially creating a cure, and you're left pretty conflicted about that. And only as I've gotten older I realised that I would do the same thing as Joel, but when I played that as a 17-year-old, I was kind of like, I wouldn't do that as Joel. Like, I wouldn't save Ellie. So it's kind of nice to grow up and realise how I would act in that situation compared to how I thought I would react. And to a lot of fans, that was a controversial ending at the time. A lot of people might not remember if you're younger, but that was controversial. And then the second game, they doubled down even more. They're like, we don't care what you like. It's going to be about the story. And I thought his use in the game was perfect in that scene for Ellie's birthday and getting these moments with Joel. It's something you want so bad, and they're just teasing you with it throughout, and he kind of lingers over the whole game. But the actual plot between Ellie and Abby, I think, is far better than the first game, and I actually think Abby is probably my favourite Last of Us character. Just such an amazing performance by Laura Bailey. But of course, like I said, it's not the main part of the plot, because the main part really is about these cycles of violence, cycles of revenge between Ellie and Allie, which can be seen through the lens of Israel-Palestine. But the most apparent part of this Israel-Palestine conflict is, like I said, the conflict between the Washington Liberation Front and the Seraphites, who are essentially like these religious extremists, and I think they're meant to be a stand-in for Hamas. So, like I said, Neil Druckmann grew up in Israel, and I actually have found some clips of him talking to IGN Israel. I'm really sorry because the audio on this is absolute garbage. I don't know why it's so bad, but I think it's really important to go into how the director's own life experience has influenced The Last of Us, and there might be other Israelis on the team, there might be other Jewish people on the team because there's a whole bit about a synagogue. But I think it's obviously most important to point out his relationship to this stuff. So let's quickly look at the IGN Israel interview first, and then we'll just read some articles where he actually talks about the influence of Israeli politics on The Last of Us.
Please give us a minute about your work, your career, and how did you start in the gaming industry?
Oh, okay. Let me stay high level as much as I can. I grew up in Israel. I grew up in the West Bank in a town called Betoye, and I lived there until 89, but my older brother was really into video games. So from as early as I can remember, we just played computer games nonstop.
Really?
And I actually learned English playing a lot of old adventure games like King's Quest and Space Quest and those kind of very narrative-driven games. So that was kind of like early inspiration.
And one last question. So we were talking about violence. So it's safe to say that the game main theme are revenge and merciless violence, as we were saying. So was this like your intention all along, or that was something that evolved in time, you know? Is that your way to reflect the unforgiving world of The Last of Us?
I think it's a way to reflect the unforgiving world that we live in. You live in a part of the world, right? You live in a part of the world that's constantly dealing with cycle of violence and retribution, and I know it's much more complex than that. But it's hard to break that cycle. It's really hard. Like, part of the themes or part of the takeaway is that one side can't stop. If only one side stops, it keeps going. It's like both sides have to let go.
Yeah.
And again, the game is reflecting the world that we live in with the violence that happens in the game. Some of it is exaggerated because for gameplay mechanics, we're after a certain feeling that might have a bigger body count than a real life situation like that, let's say. But the themes and the philosophical questions are similar. Like, when should you stop? When is it like too much to pursue justice at any cost? And the game ultimately deals with forgiveness, that even if you are just, even if you are righteous, it can still destroy you to pursue it to the nth degree.
So yes, Neil Druckmann did grow up in the West Bank, and he does talk about how, you know, the Israeli conflict with Palestine does influence this game because, like the critic in the Vice article says later, is that it's a centrist view that both sides stopped, then you could solve this issue, but it's because both sides keep going, and like I said, that is quite a centrist view of the conflict because one side is doing something to the other side that the other side cannot even do to the Israelis. Now I want to move on to the Last of Us podcast. Now this podcast is absolutely amazing. Like, it's one of the best produced podcasts I've ever listened to. It's basically 8 episodes, 4 on The Last of Us 1, 4 on The Last of Us 2, interviews people who designed the combat, obviously interviews Druckmann, Troy Baker, Ashley Johnson, Laura Bailey, lots of audio from the games, scenes from the games. It's really great. If you didn't know this exists, please seek this out. It's so good. I've listened to it about 3 times now. I love these games so much. But here is him talking about the influence of Israeli politics and his own experience on the first Last of Us game.
Funny you say the hard decision, and I think about Joel, and for him it's not a hard decision. It's a no decision. Like, I'm not going to stop to do anything that will put my daughter at risk. And if I go on a tangent real quick, I'm originally from Israel, so I follow a lot of Israeli politics. And there was this guy, Gilad Shalit, a soldier who was kidnapped and held prisoner for years by Hamas. And then there was an exchange of hundreds of prisoners for this one soldier. And some of the prisoners that were exchanged had blood on their hands, like committed horrible terrorist acts. And there was a big debate in Israel, was it right to like exchange so many people that were in prison for this one soldier to bring him back? And I remember I talked with my dad about it, and I'm like, what do you think? Do you think that was the right decision? And he says, are you asking me as like the soldier's dad or as the prime minister of Israel? Because that would make 2 very different decisions. As the prime minister of Israel, I think they made the wrong decision. I think they're now less safe because they made this thing. As the guy's dad, I would have traded every prisoner in every prison for this guy. And that's really what the story is about. Do the ends justify the means? And it's really so much about perspective. If it was maybe to save a strange kid versus a family, maybe Joel would have made a very different decision. But when it was like his tribe, his daughter, there was no question about what he's going to do.
So there he's kind of talking about how the ending of The Last of Us 1 is influenced by this one event between Israel and Palestine. And from a matter of perspective, you can rationalize what someone like Joel does. So in this context, it's handing over a bunch of Hamas prisoners, I guess, to Gaza and to the Hamas leadership. And in exchange, they give you one Israeli soldier. And like he was saying, if that was your son, then you would do anything. If you were the government of Israel, maybe you might take a different approach, even though they did, trade them back. And because they're less safe because of this, like in the end of Last of Us Part 1, Joel chooses to save Ellie, but is the world less safe because there is no vaccine, I guess. So it's clear Israeli politics has always influenced this game. Druckmann also elaborates a bit further on what we heard in that interview with IGN Israel in talking about how it influences the politics of Part 2. So an interview, or like this profile piece on the Washington Post called The Evolution of Ellie, talks about this. So it says, the formulation for Ellie's turn towards darkness can be traced back to the year 2000. Then in his early 20s, Neil Druckmann witnessed news footage of a crowd lynching 2 Israeli soldiers in the West Bank, and they cheered afterward. Druckmann, who grew up in Israel, recalls, it was the cheering that was really chilling to me. In my mind, I thought, oh man, if I could push a button and kill all these people that committed this horrible act, I would make them feel the same pain they had inflicted on these people. The feeling faded though. Eventually he looked back and felt gross and guilty for his intense feelings with The Last of Us Part 2. He wanted to explore that emotional tumult on a didactic level. I landed on this emotional idea of, can we, over the course of the game, make you feel this intense hate that is universal in the same way that unconditional love is universal. This hate that people feel that has the same kind of universality. You hate someone so much that you want them to suffer in the same way they've made someone you love suffer. So very clearly, events in Israeli politics have a direct influence on The Last of Us, even though you might not have known it. If you didn't hear Neil Druckmann talk about these events in his life, that influenced his way of thinking. So in this instance, it's seeing this lynching of 2 Israeli soldiers and wanting vengeance against the people who did it, all the people involved, but then later regretting such hateful feeling. And he's saying the universal feeling of love, which is shown through The Last of Us, through the bonds between Joel and Ellie, or Abby and her friends, or Ellie and Dina, you also have the same, I guess, universal emotion of hate. Like the way Ellie hates Abby, or the way Abby hates Joel before she kills him, and I guess about how this cycle of violence is often driven by these intense emotions. Now, Neil Druckmann's role in The Last of Us 2 was bigger than The Last of Us 1, but it's clear he does have this massive influence on both games. Now, I don't know if this is like a self-insert, but there is a whole bit about Judaism in The Last of Us Part 2. I couldn't find this in my research, but Neil Druckmann, like a lot of Israelis, seems quite secular, maybe even atheist. I kind of get that feeling because most of the characters in the game don't believe in God. And Dina, who is Jewish, also doesn't really believe in God either. So that's why I'm kind of thinking Druckmann doesn't actually believe in God either. But in terms of The Last of Us Part 2, there is a moment where you explore a synagogue with Dina and you talk about things in terms of like the Torah, the Jewish calendar, and of course, mention to the Holocaust and how Jews survived the Holocaust. And there's actually like a letter from the rabbi talking about how his family fled Germany with the help of like Polish people, and then he is kind of repeating this cycle where he has to flee his home again, like many Jews have always done.
This place brings back a lot of memories. My sister used to drag me to a synagogue all the time.
You never struck me as much of a believer.
Nah, but I like coming from a long line of survivors.
You mean after Outbreak Day?
That, and the Inquisition, and the Holocaust. My family always made it out alive. Barely.
Do you still pray?
Sometimes.
Really? When?
I said one when we left Jackson. I said one at Joel's grave. Sometimes I just say little ones to myself.
Does it help?
I think it calms me. Helps me put things in perspective. It's a way to deal with grief. A way to show respect. It's what I know.
What's this?
Oh, this is the Torah.
The what?
It's scripture. It's like a Jewish Bible.
5774? Are we in the future?
No, doofus, that's a Hebrew calendar. For the new year, my sister used to give me an apple dipped in honey. Ugh, now I'm craving it.
Ooh, that does sound pretty good.
Jewish holidays are all about food and celebrating not getting annihilated by our enemies.
So my take on this is I see Dina's view on this stuff as kind of like Neil Druckmann's view. But like I said, I don't know how many Jewish people worked on The Last of Us. I know various scenes were written by different people. Druckmann isn't the guy who like writes every single bit of the gameplay, so it could be another person in Naughty Dog who did, create this scene. And I guess the mention to the Holocaust is the only way you can tie that scene explicitly to Israel, because the Holocaust is such a big motivating factor for so many Jewish people to both go to Palestine and so many Zionist insurgents to actually fight for creating the state of Israel. So now I've shown you how Neil Druckmann's personal experience living in Israel and growing up there and his views on Israeli politics has influenced the game. But now let's get into the more like explicit parallels, and that is the conflict between the WLF, in my opinion, a stand-in for the IDF, and of course the Seraphite. First, let's just start off with a general impression of what I got from what I was playing. So the WLF reminds me of the IDF in many ways because it's this more like secular organization. Women fight in the WLF army. Abby is of course like one of their best soldiers. You can also be gay in the WLF. The most explicit reference I think was this one part. I think you might even be playing as Ellie, and one female soldier is talking about, missing their girlfriend or something like that. And it feels like quite modern on the surface, and it actually feels like old America compared to a lot of other groups in The Last of Us. Like Jackson feels like rural America, but more like socialistic because everyone's working together to just survive. But the WLF feels a bit more authoritarian, more like Israel, where you have this mandatory service and you have to do it. Like you have to join the IDF, for example, if you grow up in Israel, except for some religious exemptions. And you also assume from Abby's reaction to finding out Lev is transgender, that I guess transgender people are somewhat tolerated by the WLF. Now compare that to the Seraphites, who are essentially religious extremists who believe in this prophet. Of course, when you hear about religion focusing on a singular prophet, you think of Islam. And in this society, it is sexist. Although women do fight, it's shown through like Lev that there are like arranged marriages. So child marriage could maybe even be a thing with their society. And also another part of the game that leads me to believe the Seraphites are standing for Hamas is because Lev and Yara talk a lot about their religion, and Abby sees it quite positively when she speaks to these two people. And basically they say that the elders in the tribe, the elders of the Seraphites, have perverted this religion to use it for, I guess, their violent ends. And a lot of people would say that about groups like Hamas. Like, Islam is no more or no less violent than like Christianity or Judaism. It's religious extremist groups like Hamas that weaponize this religion to make people carry out acts of terror. So at least that's my reading of the situation. And before we go into the backstory of both of them, just to elaborate a bit further, there's lots of bits in the game which, to me, someone who like knows a lot about Israeli history, really kind of remind me of stuff about Israel. So there's this one scene early on, you're with Manny and Mel, and they talk about how the truce between the Seraphites and the WLF broke down, and they talk about a whole squad being strung up by the Seraphites, but then Mel reminds them, well, it was the WLF who actually killed a bunch of Seraphite children first, and that's why they did it in retaliation, but Abby and Manny don't really care.
Getting nostalgic about the truce? Easier days, huh?
Too easy. We never guarded them, and they strung up an entire squad.
That was in retaliation to us shooting those kids.
Okay, but those kids attacked our guys. What would you do?
I don't know, not riddle them with bullets?
I'd rather save our people.
Manny, they're kids. It's not their fault.
Not our fault either. Those deaths are on them.
Okay.
And obviously when you hear about a bunch of children being killed or children in prison, these are common news stories you hear coming out of Gaza and Palestine all the time, especially during the 2014 invasion of Gaza or the bombing of Gaza in 2021. Most casualties by the IDF are usually civilians, and children, of course, are often put in Israeli prisons without a trial. Now, there's also other stuff like Isaac and his torture of the Seraphites, and this reminds me a lot of both like the War on Terror and Israeli prisons, and Abby saying she wants to get, a few moments of these guys to essentially torture them herself, just showing how this hatred really manifests in people.
I don't miss this place. Fuck. Always hated the smell.
After our morning, I wouldn't mind a few minutes with these guys.
I hear that.
And there's also this scene where Isaac, the leader of the WLF, is planning an invasion of the island. The island is the Seraphites' home. I think there's, of course, big parallels with the island and Gaza. And he talks about going in there, invading, and basically killing them all because it has to end this conflict. It has to end. And the only solution to ending this is total genocide of the other side.
These small skirmishes. Can't keep going like this.
Then what?
We could try another truce. But how long before some asshole on their side or our side unravels the whole thing? No. It has to be all of them.
Sir, we try attacking their island.
Not like this. Not with everyone. There's a big storm a few days out. We're gonna use it to mask our approach. You two are gonna lead the first wave. Pick your squads, start prepping.
So I'm not going to say most Israeli political figures speak like Isaac does here. I will say, and I played you a clip in my video last Monday, there are people in Israel who do actually think about this in Gaza. Here's a clip from Abby Martin interviewing an Israeli who talks about the need to carpet bomb Palestine, and I think probably Gaza in this situation, because that's the only way they'll ever stop fighting Israel.
I don't think there's any answer to it. There's only one way, I would carpet bomb them.
You would carpet bomb them?
It's the only way you could deal with it. Or try to stop them a different way. It never worked.
You mean all Arabs or Gaza or?
I believe that they, I hope to believe they're not, but I do think they are, because I don't trust them. You can't trust them. And that's the only way I believe that. The only way is just to stop it completely.
So look, I'm not saying that is the dominant view in Israel or the dominant view in Israeli politics. I have heard a lot of Israeli extremists express this, and Israeli settlers who are often backed by the Israeli government talk about essentially killing all Arabs in Palestine. So that is just kind of like a surface level reading of the situation in the game, but the backstory is actually very interesting and leads me to believe even more that this whole thing is inspired by Israel-Palestine, because the WLF originally aren't fighting the Seraphites, they're actually fighting Fedra, which is essentially the US government, this authoritarian US government, which controls the zones like Ellie grew up in, and obviously Joel finds himself in at the start of The Last of Us 1. And I think Fedra in this situation are essentially a stand-in for the British mandate and the British government control of Palestine after World War I until the end of World War II. If you guys are unfamiliar with this, basically, before the Zionists and Arabs started fighting, before the creation of Israel, Zionist insurgents were actually fighting the British, killing British soldiers, obviously famously blowing up a hotel. And funnily enough, I think Begin, who was one of the leaders of one of these Zionist militias, he wrote a book about how to fight an insurgency war. And ironically enough, Yasser Arafat was actually someone who read this book and thought it was very helpful, as did the Taliban, as did Che Guevara, as did the IRA. I find it very ironic that Israel has always demonized the PLO and their tactics, while a lot of the first leaders of Israel literally created the handbook that these people use to fight their occupation. So with everything I've outlined for you in mind, so the WLF are the IDF, or Zionist militias before the formation of Israel. Fedra are the British government and the Seraphites are the Palestinians. I'm going to read you the wiki and let me know, do you think this sounds like Israeli history? So let's start with the WLF. After the cordyceps brain infection outbreak, civilians living in Seattle were placed under Fedra's and the US military's control within a quarantine zone. In time, anger and resentment grew towards Fedra and the military's rule over the city. Emma and Jason Patterson were two of countless residents enraged by the expulsions, food shortages, and executions the military conducted under Lieutenant Torres and Sergeant Ward. By the mid-2020s, the Pattersons formed the WLF, nicknamed the Wolves, to fight for better living conditions for civilians in the zone. They recruited several people into their group, including Isaac Dixon, who is the leader in The Last of Us Part 2. However, their protests quickly escalated into an anti-Fedra campaign, with the Pattersons and their small group of members distributing anti-Fedra propaganda, stealing the military supplies, and inciting sedition among the Seattle residents. Their actions led to Ward marking them all as wanted terrorists. Eventually, the Pattersons were eliminated by the military, leaving Isaac as the last remaining leader of the rebellion. In retaliation for their deaths, Isaac killed 3 Fedra soldiers. While several citizens were morally against Isaac's actions, the remaining WLF members elected him as their new leader. Over the coming weeks, the WLF committed attacks on military checkpoints, assaulted convoys, and committed open armed conflict against the military. Within a few months, the WLF successfully captured all of Fedra's military checkpoints in the city. With that, the WLF successfully won the war against Fedra. With Fedra and the military now gone, the WLF were the city's primary faction, containing and ruling over thousands of survivors from across Seattle. However, they soon broke their promise of liberation, instead pushing for everyone in the city to join the group as members of the militia and to swear their loyalty to the group. Once members within a suburb swore their allegiance to the WLF, the soldiers then transformed the area into zones that the WLF soldiers had complete control over. They enforced a strict curfew on the residents and banned anyone from helping or associating with any potential or former Fedra personnel. They also only allowed citizens to leave a specified zone with express permission from the area's senior officer. A problem caused by the mass hordes of infected on supply routes that the military failed to solve. To fix this problem, Isaac ordered the WLF soldiers to forcefully move Seattle civilians from their homes to the Soundview Stadium to contain everyone and centralize the supply distribution. Many civilians resisted, but the WLF expressed no mercy, instead forcefully expelling dissidents from the suburbs and stealing their supplies. The WLF's dictatorial actions caused several residents to conclude that they were worse rulers than Fedra. By the early 2030s, the WLF had transformed their centralized community at Soundview Stadium into a safe haven, with solar panels and wind turbines installed to provide power. They turned the weight room into a training area for soldiers, created classrooms for children, and made use of the dining halls, maintained the library, and turned the field into a large farming area to grow their own food and raise livestock. So now switching over to the Seraphite cultists, I guess. So the Seraphites began in the lower Queen Anne suburb in the Seattle QZ between September 2013 and March 2014. It was here a woman supposedly had a vision from which she became inspired to live an egalitarian life and strive for humanity to live on the land again. Detached from the mortal pleasures and reliance on technology, she was also a fierce fighter, able to defeat infected that attacked the community. Her charismatic sermons preaching that the cordyceps brain infection was a punishment for and brought on by humanity's own sin and was a second chance for humanity to redeem itself inspired members in the community to do likewise, with the residents soon living independently. They fought off infected and looters and grew food on land that they lived on. In time, the woman became their leader and was dubbed the Prophet. So once the WLF defeated the military, the Seraphites pushed into the city suburbs that were formerly under the military's protection and began to terrorize the people residing there. The residents, in fear, moved from the suburbs and took up the WLF's offer to join them and fight back against the Seraphites. As the tensions with the WLF rose, members of the Seraphites faced persecution in the suburbs. To escape the WLF's tyranny, the Seraphites remained fixed within the lower Queen Anne suburb. Flooding over the years split it from the rest of the city, meaning the Seraphite had a geographical barrier separating them from the WLF, the area only reachable by boat. The suburb was subsequently called an island by many in Seattle in 2038. At some point, the WLF successfully captured the Prophet. They held her at one of their outposts. Prophet's actions led to the WLF's leader, Isaac, deeming her too dangerous to keep alive, and as such, he arranged her execution. After she was killed, the elders assumed control over the Seraphites, carried on the war in her absence. Her death only increased the fighting spirit, leading to the group launching a lethal assault on the outpost where the Prophet was killed. In time, the Seraphites and WLF came to a truce, briefly ending their conflict. They agreed to no longer fight, so long as the Seraphites did not disrupt WLF's supply routes and patrols. The WLF assured the Seraphites they would not invade their territory, which led to an uneasy peace. So obviously I'm not saying that these two groups are directly modelled on Hamas and the IDF, but I do believe Hamas and the IDF are inspirations for both, because of course like the Seraphites have their own kind of like Last of Us uniqueness to them, as do the WLF, but I think it's clear that the whole conflict between them and the existence of Fedra as well make it seem like the Zionist insurgency against the British Mandate, and then the subsequent Israeli-Arab conflicts and just the general conflicts with Palestinian territories. And although I think this conflict is a bit too specific to have been inspired by anything else, of course the message can be applied to various different conflicts in terms of occupation forces dominating another group of people and then rising up and fighting back. I just believe in this specific context, it's pretty clear to me it's meant to be the IDF and Hamas, and it's meant to be about Israel and Gaza. So hopefully of all the evidence I have presented, you do now understand that The Last of Us Part 2 is like deeply inspired by Israeli politics and Israeli history. But to go into one last bit, I want to read you some criticism of this depiction of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict by a writer at Vice. So this article came out nearly 2 years ago, so the not-so-hidden Israeli politics of The Last of Us Part 2. So it has this image of Ellie and Dina near a border wall, which actually looks like one from the West Bank where Druckmann grew up. So this article is by Emmanuel Mayberg, and they grew up in Israel as well. And they say, a cycle of violence is a tempting way to interpret the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or any conflict, because it signals careful nuance while quietly squashing more difficult conversations. By suggesting that both the wolves and scars are equally implicated and equally in pain, we are free to stop thinking about the problem. All parties include both good and bad actors. We're all human, both sides. This is a common centrist position on violent conflict. While better than absolute dehumanization, it's not coincidentally a worldview that allows conflicts to drag on forever. Suggesting moral equivalence and asymmetry in ability between sides also invites us to throw up our hands and give up on better solutions because of implied and unexamined perceptions about human nature. Indeed, the game is unrelentingly cynical. It's certainly true that individual lives get wrapped up in larger conflicts in horrible ways. Cycles of violence exist in practice as escalations and retributions. A defining feature of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is the macabre bargaining over which violence is worse. Images of exploded buses are presented next to collapsed buildings and children being pulled from the rubble. Armed factions swear to deliver retaliation over specific incidents and do. But cycles of violence are a poor way to understand the conflict in a meaningful way, especially if one is interested in finding a solution. The US hasn't been at war in Afghanistan for almost 20 years because it's trapped in a cycle of violence with the Taliban. It is deliberately choosing to engage with a problem in a way that perpetuates a conflict, just as the fantasy of escaping violence by simply walking away from it is one that only those with the means to do so can entertain. The myth of the cycle of violence is one that benefits a side that can survive the status quo. In The Last of Us Part 2 Seattle, scars and wolves hurt each other terribly, and the same can be said about Israel and Palestine. The difference is that when flashes of violence abate and the smoke clears, one side continues to live freely and prosper, while the other goes back to a life of occupation and humiliation. One side continues to expand, while the other continues to lose the land it needs to live. Imagining this process as some kind of symmetric cycle benefits one side more than the other and allows it to continue. Then he talks about that mob killing Druckmann talked about earlier, and this guy says, I too have seen the video of the 2000 mob killing of the Israeli soldiers, and it's horrific. Yet my immediate response wasn't, oh man, if I could just push a button and kill those people that committed this act, I would. This is not a universal feeling as much as it's a learned way of seeing the world. There are many other ways to react to the video: compassion for the victims, compassion for the killers, questioning why the soldiers had to drive into the West Bank in the first place, questioning what would drive a mob to this kind of violence. Revenge and hate is just one option. The Last of Us Part 2 is an incredible journey that provides not only one of the most mesmerizing spectacles that we've seen from a video game, but one that manages to ask the difficult questions. It's clearly coming from an emotional, authentic, and self-examining place. The trouble with it, and the reason that Ellie's journey ultimately feels nonsensical, is that it begins from a place that accepts intense hate that is universal as a fact of life, rather than examining where and why this behaviour is learned. So I thought it was good to share what someone who grew up in Israel also thinks about the depiction of the conflict in the game. Now, they didn't really like the ending, and they didn't really like Ellie's journey. I would say I did like it, and I understood it, but I also understood where they're coming from, because with Neil Druckmann's quote, I've never really had a feeling like that before, and he's saying, well, where do you learn this feeling? So, for example, with 9/11 in America, right? They had to punish someone. They wanted revenge on people, and that allowed the George Bush administration to be like, well, Afghanistan, all those people did it. Or Iraq, those people did it. They deserved the punishment, and loads of Americans, most Americans in fact, were like, hell yeah, let's go kill them all. That's what they wanted to do in revenge for 9/11. And of course, not all Americans acted that way. But where did the Americans who did react that way learn to react that way? And I think that's a really interesting point. I also like the point that the way it depicts the conflict in the game makes it seem like both sides are at fault. Yes, the WOF are technically more advanced, and they're also probably like more powerful. They have more technology, but by and large, they aren't really doing much to the Seraphites, right? It's like a conflict. And what they do at the end is obviously like really bad. They want to kill them all. And the Seraphites haven't actually tried to kill every WOF soldier in the way that they're trying to kill them, but it does present it as like this murky conflict where the only really option to solve it is just be like, well, we'll both stop fighting and we'll walk away. But if you guys know about occupational conflict and like from, you know, Ireland to Palestine, the reason one side does terrible things versus the reason another side does terrible things is completely different, right? So the British government and army killed Irish civilians and occupied Ireland for like 800 years because they wanted another colony, and they created like this hierarchy where if you were from the Protestant Church of England religion and you had like a Scottish or English background, you were seen as more than the Irish Catholics who were native to Ireland. The same way with Israel's apartheid. Yes, stuff that Hamas and the IRA did were totally horrible. They would kill innocent civilians, they would blow up trucks of soldiers, they do all these terrible things. The reason they would do those things, though, was a reaction to a brutal system that dehumanized them, the same way the Palestinians have historically reacted to their own oppression. This is something that has happened throughout human history. And although you can say that like violence breeds violence, like if the US drone strikes a wedding to kill one terrorist but kills 5 civilians, then you've just created more terrorists. People understand that. But I think if you're going to use so much from Israel-Palestine and try and like both sides of the conflict, I think you're failing in using that. And like this article says, ultimately, it's a very centrist Israeli position. Like, in my opinion, Druckmann is probably like a liberal Zionist who probably thinks that, you know, Israel's treatment of the Palestinians is actually really, really bad. Probably should go back to maybe like pre-1967 borders, if that. But at the end of the day, Israel has a right to exist. Zionism isn't inherently racist. And like people like Natalie Portman, their problem is really like the right wing in Israel. It's not so much of this, you know, construct of settler colonialism. A video I've been trying to make for far too long. Because of my Metal Gear Rising video doing so bad, I feel like this video will also do bad. But if you made it this far, please like, leave a comment. Hope you enjoyed it. And thank you so much for watching.